Brain Defenders Summary: David Perlmutter's plan to protect your brain from cognitive decline. The science of protecting your brain for life. Brain Defenders: Harness the power of your immune cells to protect your brain for life is a 2026 health and neuroscience book by neurologist David Perlmutter. Perlmutter is best known for books including Grain Brain, Brain Maker, Brainwash, and Drop Acid. His recurring territory is the connection between metabolism, nutrition, and neurological health. Brain Defenders narrows the lens considerably. Rather than beginning with carbohydrates, the microbiome, or uric acid, he makes one group of cells the center of the story: microglia. That choice is scientifically significant. Modern neuroscience does increasingly regard microglia as active participants in brain development, synaptic maintenance, inflammation, aging, and neurological disease, rather than passive housekeeping cells. Recent scientific reviews have also identified microglial metabolism as an important and rapidly developing area of Alzheimer's research. Perlmutter takes that emerging science and asks a practical question: if microglial behavior partly depends upon metabolic and environmental signals, how much influence do we have over the conditions in which our brains age? That is the engine of the book. The big idea of the book. Perlmutter wants readers to stop thinking about neurological disease solely as something that begins when symptoms become noticeable. Memory loss, impaired movement, depression, or cognitive deterioration may be the visible consequences of processes that have been developing for years. Waiting for those symptoms, and then attempting to suppress them, he argues, means intervening exceptionally late. His alternative model begins with the brain's immune system. Microglia patrol the central nervous system. They respond to damage and pathogens, clear debris, interact with neurons, influence synapses, and participate in inflammatory signaling. In a healthy context, those abilities are essential. But immune activity is not automatically beneficial simply because it is defensive. The same mechanisms capable of protecting tissue can become harmful when inflammatory activity becomes persistent or poorly regulated. That is the paradox Perlmutter builds the book around. The brain defender can become part of the threat. His second major step is connecting immune behavior to cellular metabolism. The concept is immunometabolism. Immune cell function and cellular energy processing are intimately connected. If metabolic conditions change, immune cell behavior can change with them. Perlmutter, therefore, links brain aging to a larger network involving glucose regulation, insulin sensitivity, mitochondria, diet, exercise, sleep, chronic stress, gut microbes, alcohol, toxins, infection, and aging itself. This gives him a much broader prevention model than simply telling readers to avoid dementia. Protect the metabolic environment, and you may improve the conditions in which microglia operate. Protect microglia, and you may strengthen neurological resilience. That is his thesis. It is also where the book is simultaneously at its most interesting and its most vulnerable to overstatement. Microglial immunometabolism is a genuine and important scientific field. But demonstrating that microglial dysfunction contributes to disease is not identical to proving that a particular supplement, diet, or lifestyle intervention can reliably reprogram human microglia sufficiently to prevent Alzheimer's disease. That distinction matters throughout the book. The argument in one flow. The paradigm shift. Stop waiting for the brain to fail. Perlmutter opens by challenging the conventional timing of neurological medicine. A person might spend decades accumulating metabolic problems, poor sleep, cardiovascular risk, inactivity, and chronic inflammation. Yet serious concern about brain health may not begin until memory or movement starts deteriorating. By then, substantial biological change may already exist. Perlmutter therefore wants prevention moved earlier. The question should not merely be, how do we treat Alzheimer's disease? It should also be, what determines whether the brain remains resilient enough to resist or compensate for the processes associated with degeneration? That distinction between pathology and resilience becomes important. Two people can accumulate neurological abnormalities without necessarily displaying identical cognitive outcomes. Brain health is therefore not simply a binary competition between having or not having a particular pathological marker. Perlmutter argues that resilience matters too. That observation pushes the conversation beyond amyloid. Amyloid beta remains central to Alzheimer's research and treatment, but Perlmutter objects to treating it as the entire explanation. He wants readers to examine the inflammatory and metabolic terrain surrounding the disease as well. This is not an absurd fringe position. Contemporary Alzheimer's research investigates complex interactions involving amyloid, tau, vascular dysfunction, genetics, immune activity, lipid metabolism, and microglial states. Where brain defenders becomes more distinctive is its insistence that microglia provide a useful organizing principle linking many of those processes. Instead of viewing exercise, sleep, metabolic health, and diet as a miscellaneous collection of healthy habits, Perlmutter tries to place them within one biological framework. They are signals entering the system. Microglia are among the cells responding to those signals. Microglia, the brain's resident immune system. Microglia are specialized immune cells of the central nervous system. Their ordinary jobs are extensive. They survey their environment, respond to injury, remove damaged material, and interact continuously with neurons and other cells. Their role in shaping and maintaining neural circuits means that the popular description, immune cells of the brain, is correct, but incomplete. They are not police officers sitting idle until infection arrives. They are part of the infrastructure. That matters because Perlmutter's argument depends upon rejecting an older, static view of the brain. The nervous system is constantly maintaining itself. Cells communicate. Connections strengthen or weaken. Metabolic substrates arrive or fail to arrive. Inflammatory signals rise and fall. Damage occurs and is repaired. Microglia operate inside this changing environment. When inflammatory activation becomes prolonged, however, the chemistry that initially serves a protective purpose may contribute to neuronal injury, synaptic dysfunction, or destructive feedback loops. This duality gives the book its title. The cells defending the brain cannot simply be classified as good. They respond to context. The M1-2 model, useful, but too simple. Perlmutter frequently explains microglial behavior through a broadly protective versus inflammatory framework, commonly described using M2 and M1 states. As a teaching device, the distinction is easy to remember. Protective microglia support repair. Dysregulated inflammatory microglia become destructive. But this is one area where readers should know that current neuroscience is more complicated than the binary model suggests. Recent reviews emphasize that human microglia occupy multiple dynamic states rather than neatly flipping between two fixed identities. Single-cell and transcriptomic research increasingly portrays microglial behavior as a continuum shaped by disease, location, age, and cellular environment. The classic M1-2 classification is now widely regarded as an oversimplification when applied literally to microglia. That does not destroy Perlmutter's underlying argument. Microglia absolutely can participate in both neuroprotective and damaging inflammatory processes. But readers should treat the good microglia versus bad microglia language as a conceptual map rather than a complete description of current immunology. The real biology is messier, and that messiness actually strengthens one of the book's larger lessons. Immune behavior depends upon context. Immunometabolism, the book's most important scientific idea. The conceptual center of brain defenders is not inflammation alone. It is immunometabolism. Cells require energy to perform particular tasks. Changes in energy availability and metabolic pathways can influence the behavior of immune cells. Microglia are no exception. Recent research increasingly connects altered microglial metabolism with neuroinflammation and neurodegenerative disease, particularly Alzheimer's disease. Researchers are examining interactions between mitochondrial function, glucose utilization, lipid metabolism, and disease-associated microglial states. Perlmutter uses this mechanism to connect apparently unrelated health advice. Why care about blood glucose? Because metabolic dysfunction can change inflammatory signaling. Why exercise? Because exercise affects insulin sensitivity, circulation, mitochondrial function, and systemic inflammation. Why sleep properly? Because sleep disruption alters metabolic and inflammatory processes. Why care about the microbiome? Because microbial products and metabolites can influence systemic immunity, which interacts with the brain. Why minimize ultra-processed food? because dietary patterns can influence metabolic and vascular health. The advantage of this framework is coherence. A weaker health book might contain 15 isolated rules. Eat this. Avoid that. Exercise. Sleep more. Take supplements. Brain Defenders tries to show why those behaviors might converge biologically. The unifying question becomes, what environment are you creating for the cells that maintain your brain, the microbiome, and brain health? Perlmutter then extends the argument beyond the skull. The brain is not biologically isolated from the gut. The intestinal microbiome contributes metabolites, interacts with immune pathways, and influences the integrity of the intestinal barrier. Signals arising from the gut can affect systemic inflammation and communicate indirectly and directly with the nervous system. This gut-brain relationship has become one of Perlmutter's long-standing interests. In Brain Defenders, however, the microbiome serves the microglial thesis. A disrupted intestinal environment may contribute to inflammatory signals reaching the wider body. Those signals can influence immune activity and potentially alter the environment in which microglia function. The strongest version of this argument is not that a particular probiotic will prevent dementia. It is that the nervous, metabolic, and immune systems cannot sensibly be treated as independent compartments. Brain health is partly whole body health. That is a much more defensible claim. How a good brain goes bad. After establishing the mechanism, Perlmutter spends the book's middle section examining threats. The table of contents reveals how systematic this becomes. Metabolic problems, poor diet, alcohol, medications, environmental toxins, infections, head trauma, aging, genetics, stress hormones, and sleep disruption are considered before the book moves into its intervention program. This section matters because it changes the question from what causes dementia to what repeatedly pushes the brain toward vulnerability. Metabolic dysfunction. Metabolic health receives enormous weight. Perlmutter is particularly concerned with impaired glucose control and insulin resistance. His wider argument is familiar from metabolic medicine. Chronically abnormal glucose regulation is associated with cardiovascular disease and several other long-term health risks, and metabolic dysfunction overlaps with risk factors associated with cognitive decline. Perlmutter wants readers to measure, rather than assume. In recent discussions of the book, he has highlighted blood glucose, HbA1c, and fasting insulin, and has supported occasional continuous glucose monitoring as a way of understanding individual responses to food. There is an important distinction, however. A glucose spike after eating does not mean neurons are immediately being destroyed, nor does achieving perfectly flat glucose prove protection against dementia. The useful interpretation is more modest. Maintaining good metabolic and cardiovascular health is likely to be beneficial for long-term brain health, and serious metabolic dysfunction should not be treated as unrelated to the brain. Poor diet. Diet follows logically. Perlmutter dislikes ultra-processed food, added sugar, and dietary patterns that repeatedly produce poor metabolic outcomes. The ideal diet in his framework is therefore not defined purely by calories. He wants a pattern that stabilizes metabolic markers, contains abundant plant foods, supplies fiber and polyphenols, and supports the microbiome. He is sympathetic to Mediterranean-style and lower carbohydrate approaches, and discusses ketogenic metabolism more positively than many mainstream dietary guides. But one of the more useful developments in his recent explanation is an emphasis on metabolic outcome, rather than demanding one universal diet. Different people may eat differently. The fundamental question becomes what the pattern does to their broader metabolic health. This is a stronger argument than insisting that everyone must follow one branded dietary philosophy. Alcohol. Perlmutter gives alcohol little health halo. That is increasingly consistent with the direction of public health discussion. The old image of modest drinking as inherently protective has become harder to defend because observational alcohol research is susceptible to confounding, and because alcohol has well-established toxic, carcinogenic, and neurological effects. For brain protection, his message is therefore straightforward. There is little reason to start drinking for health. That does not mean a single glass guarantees neurological damage. It means alcohol should not be mistaken for brain medicine. Medication. The medication discussion requires more care. Some drugs can affect cognition, alertness, or neurological function, particularly in older adults, and especially when several medications interact. But medication is far too broad a category to treat as intrinsically harmful. The sensible lesson is medication review, not medication fear. Readers should not discontinue prescribed treatment because a popular health book describes potential neurological side effects. The relevant questions are which medicine, what dose for which person for what condition, against what untreated risk. That risk-benefit calculation belongs with an appropriate clinician. Environmental toxins. Environmental exposure gives Perlmutter another way to expand the microglial model. Air pollution, pesticides, industrial chemicals, and other exposures are increasingly investigated for associations with neurological and cardiovascular disease. Here again, epidemiological association and individual causation are different. A population-level relationship between an exposure and disease risk does not mean one person can trace their neurological future to one chemical encounter. The practical value lies in reducing unnecessary chronic exposure where doing so is feasible, not living in constant fear of the environment. Infection. Infection is particularly interesting because immune activation is unavoidable during genuine biological threats. Microglia should respond. That is their job. The problem is not that inflammation exists. The question is whether inflammatory activity resolves appropriately or becomes persistent. Perlmutter includes long COVID within the broader discussion of neuroinflammation, reflecting the continuing research into neurological and cognitive symptoms after SARS-CoV-2 infection. The precise mechanisms are heterogeneous and remain under investigation, so the book's microglial framework is best understood as one possible component, rather than a settled explanation for every case. Head trauma. Head injury is one of the clearest reminders that neurological resilience has limits. Repeated traumatic brain injury is associated with long-term neurological risk. Microglia respond to trauma because damaged tissue demands an immune reaction, but recurrent or prolonged inflammatory signaling may contribute to later pathology. The practical lesson here is refreshingly uncomplicated. Preventing brain injury beats trying to reverse it afterwards. Helmets, safer sport practices, fall prevention, and sensible return-to-play decisions may sound less futuristic than neurotechnology, but they can matter enormously. Aging. Age itself changes immune function. Microglia do not behave identically at 20 and 80%. Cellular repair becomes less efficient, mitochondrial function changes, inflammatory regulation shifts, and accumulated damage increases. Perlmutter does not pretend aging can be abolished. His argument is that chronological age and biological vulnerability are not identical. Lifestyle, therefore, becomes less a quest for immortality than an attempt to preserve reserve. That word, reserve, may be more useful than optimization. You are not making the brain invulnerable. You are trying to give it more capacity to absorb future insults. Genetics. Genetics provides the book with an important philosophical test. Genes matter. The ApoE4 allele, for example, can substantially alter Alzheimer's risk. But genetic risk is not destiny. Perlmutter strongly emphasizes this distinction because fatalism undermines the entire prevention program. The right interpretation is neither genes determine everything, nor lifestyle overrides genes. It is genetic susceptibility and environment interact. Some people begin with greater biological risk. That makes risk reduction more relevant, not irrelevant. Chronic stress. Stress hormones provide another bridge between psychology and physiology. Short-term stress is adaptive. Persistent stress is different. Chronic activation of stress systems can interfere with sleep, appetite, glucose regulation, cardiovascular health, and immune signaling. The book therefore refuses to treat mental stress as separate from brain biology. That does not mean every difficult week causes neurodegeneration. It means the distinction between psychological and physical health is often far more artificial than our medical categories imply. Sleep disruption. Sleep sits near the end of Perlmutter's catalog of threats, and among the most practical. Poor sleep affects insulin sensitivity, appetite regulation, cardiovascular function, hormonal signaling, mood, and cognition. Sleep is also important to normal brain maintenance. Perlmutter recommends treating restorative sleep as infrastructure rather than a luxury. That may be one of the book's least exciting recommendations. It is also one of the most useful. People are often tempted toward supplements, testing, and futuristic therapies precisely because routine interventions feel too ordinary. But no capsule can turn 5 hours of chronically poor sleep into 8 hours of restorative sleep. How to defend your brain. At roughly the halfway point, the book changes direction. The first part builds the threat model. The later chapters ask what readers can do. The sequence is revealing. Exercise first, then diet, lifestyle choices, supplements, laboratory testing and technology, hyperbaric oxygen, pharmaceuticals, and breakthrough therapies. The ordering is valuable. It suggests that the foundation is behavioral before it becomes technological. Neuroprotective exercise. Exercise is arguably the intervention least dependent on the book's more speculative microglial claims. Physical activity improves cardiovascular fitness, insulin sensitivity, and multiple cardiometabolic risk factors. It is consistently associated with healthier aging and forms part of multi-domain dementia prevention programs. Perlmutter's microglial framing gives readers another mechanism for understanding why movement matters. But you do not need to prove that every workout directly produces a particular microglial state to justify exercise. That is an important principle for evaluating the entire book. Sometimes an intervention has strong health justification, even when the book's preferred mechanism remains incomplete. Movement also changes the psychology of prevention. Instead of asking whether you will develop dementia decades from now, exercise gives you an action with immediate benefits: fitness, glucose control, mobility, mood, strength, and cardiovascular capacity, while potentially reducing long-term neurological risk. That combination makes it unusually high value. The Brain Defender Diet. Perlmutter's dietary recommendations combine several familiar principles. Prioritize whole foods. Eat abundant, colorful plants. Increase fiber. Avoid heavy dependence on ultra-processed food. Maintain healthy glucose regulation. Support metabolic flexibility. Reduce dietary patterns that promote chronic metabolic dysfunction. He is more receptive than many conventional guidelines to ketogenic strategies and fasting, both of which fit his interest in cellular energy metabolism. This is where readers need to distinguish between plausibility, intermediate metabolic effects, and proven prevention of disease. Ketones influence brain metabolism. Fasting changes metabolic signaling. Neither fact alone establishes that ketogenic diets or fasting prevent Alzheimer's disease in the general population. Dietary interventions should therefore be evaluated according to the individual, their medical circumstances, and the strength of clinical evidence, not simply whether an elegant cellular pathway can be drawn. The practical core remains stronger than the maximal claim. A diet supporting cardiovascular and metabolic health is very likely a better brain health strategy than one dominated by ultra-processed food, excessive calories, and poorly controlled blood glucose. Microglia-friendly lifestyle choices. This chapter broadens the program beyond exercise and food. Sleep, stress regulation, meaningful social connection, and avoidance of unnecessary harmful exposures become part of the same ecological model. The brain does not receive a weekly health intervention. It receives continuous biological signals. That is one of Perlmutter's most powerful ideas. A spectacular supplement cannot compensate perfectly for a chronically destructive environment. A person cannot sleep badly, remain sedentary, smoke, drink heavily, eat poorly, and then biohack their way back to neurological resilience with one molecule. The boring basics interact. That is precisely why they matter. Brain-defending supplements. Supplements are where Brain Defenders requires a higher standard of skepticism. Perlmutter discusses compounds including lion's mane mushroom and other supplements positioned around neuroprotection, metabolic function, or inflammation. Some have interesting preclinical evidence. Some have small human trials. That is not equivalent to robust proof of dementia prevention. A 2025 systematic review of lion's mane identified 5 randomized controlled trials alongside pilot and laboratory studies. It found encouraging cognitive signals, but also a heterogeneous and still limited evidence base. That is exactly how readers should think about such interventions. Promising is a scientific category. It does not mean proven. The supplement chapter is therefore best treated as the experimental edge of the program, not its foundation. Exercise, sleep, cardiovascular risk reduction, and a healthy dietary pattern possess broader justification. Supplements should sit below those fundamentals rather than replacing them. Empowering labs and technology. Perlmutter encourages measurement. This reflects a wider movement toward personalized prevention. Instead of relying exclusively on weight or subjective impressions, readers can examine metabolic markers such as glucose regulation and other indicators relevant to cardiovascular and metabolic risk. The attraction is obvious. Measurement turns health into feedback. But there is another danger. Measurement can become surveillance without meaning. More data does not automatically create better decisions. A useful biomarker is one that changes what you reasonably do. Testing everything available can create false alarms, overdiagnosis, and anxiety, while encouraging interventions based on tiny deviations that have little demonstrated clinical significance. The right principle is therefore, measure what is actionable, not measure everything because technology allows it. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Hyperbaric oxygen is one of the book's more unconventional interventions. It involves breathing oxygen at increased atmospheric pressure in a controlled chamber. Research has explored whether hyperbaric oxygen might influence blood flow, inflammation, tissue repair, or cognitive function. There is some intriguing evidence. A 2024 systematic review and meta-analysis included 11 randomized trials involving 847 people with Alzheimer's disease and reported improvements in several cognitive measures. The researchers nevertheless called for larger, more rigorous multicenter trials, and blinding was a significant methodological issue. That makes hyperbaric oxygen a perfect example of how to read brain defenders intelligently. Do not dismiss emerging therapies simply because they are unfamiliar. But do not leap from positive early evidence to established standard therapy either. Those are different stages of evidence. Promising pharmaceuticals. Perlmutter also examines pharmaceuticals rather than presenting lifestyle as the enemy of medicine. That is important. Metformin is one example. The diabetes drug has attracted research interest because metabolic dysfunction and aging pathways overlap with neurological risk. But metformin is not currently a universally established dementia prevention drug for healthy people. The METFINGER trial illustrates where the field is heading. Researchers are testing whether combining multi-domain lifestyle intervention with metformin can reduce cognitive risk in selected older populations. The distinction between research hypothesis and clinical recommendation must remain intact. Perlmutter's broader point is more compelling than any single drug. Future neurological prevention may involve metabolic medicine, immunology, and neurology converging, rather than operating as separate disciplines, breakthrough therapies. The final scientific frontier is more ambitious still. Emerging approaches to immune modulation, genetic technology, cellular therapies, and other experimental strategies raise the possibility that future medicine may manipulate microglial behavior directly. This is where the book becomes partly a forecast. The most important word is future. An exciting laboratory mechanism does not automatically become a therapy. Many interventions that look extraordinary in cells or animals fail to produce meaningful clinical benefit in humans. Nevertheless, microglia are increasingly being investigated as therapeutic targets in neurodegenerative disease, and reviews published in 2025 describe both new biomarkers and strategies aimed at modifying microglial behavior. Perlmutter is therefore pointing toward a legitimate frontier. What remains uncertain is how quickly that frontier will translate into safe, effective treatments, the most important ideas inside the argument. Prevention begins before symptoms. The first principle is temporal. Neurological prevention should begin while the brain still works well. That does not mean becoming obsessed with dementia at 30. It means understanding that the risk factors affecting the brain also operate during the apparently healthy decades. Blood pressure matters before stroke. Metabolic health matters before diabetes. Exercise matters before frailty. Sleep matters before cognitive impairment. The absence of symptoms is not proof that prevention is irrelevant. Brain health is systemic. The second principle is integration. The brain depends upon blood vessels, metabolic substrates, hormones, immune signaling, sleep, and the wider physiology of the body. Treating neurological health as completely separate from metabolic and cardiovascular health, therefore, makes little biological sense. That may be the book's most useful lesson for non-specialists. Inflammation is context, not an enemy. The third principle requires nuance. Inflammation is not inherently bad. Without immune activation, humans would be unable to respond appropriately to infection or injury. The problem is dysregulated, inappropriate or persistent inflammatory signaling. That distinction prevents the book from collapsing into the simplistic wellness slogan that all inflammation should be eliminated. It should not. Healthy immune function requires the ability both to activate and to resolve. Resilience matters as much as pathology. Another important theme is the difference between damage and functional consequence. The brain possesses reserve and adaptive capacity. Two people with similar pathological burdens may not have identical cognitive trajectories. This does not mean pathology is unimportant. It means the biological ability to tolerate, compensate for, or respond to injury also matters. That moves health strategy towards strengthening systems, rather than chasing one disease marker. The strongest chapter or section. The strongest conceptual section is the book's treatment of immunometabolism. Why? Because it makes the rest of the book intelligible. Without immunometabolism, Brain Defenders risks becoming another collection of familiar health instructions. Exercise, sleep, eat better, reduce alcohol, manage stress, look after metabolic health. Through immunometabolism, those behaviors become parts of one system. Perlmutter is effectively asking readers to think one level deeper. Do not ask only whether exercise burns calories. Ask what repeated exercise does to insulin sensitivity, mitochondria, blood vessels, immune signaling, and the environment experienced by the brain. Do not ask only whether sleep makes you feel rested. Ask what chronic sleep disruption does to the systems regulating metabolism and inflammation. The framework transforms prevention from a checklist into systems thinking. That is the intellectual contribution that most clearly distinguishes Brain Defenders from ordinary wellness books. The weakest chapter or section. The weakest territory is where emerging interventions can sound more clinically mature than the evidence warrants. This applies particularly to supplements and some advanced therapies. A biological mechanism is seductive. If substance X influences pathway Y, and pathway Y affects microglia, and microglia participate in Alzheimer's disease, it becomes tempting to conclude that taking X will prevent Alzheimer's. Science rarely works that cleanly. The human organism contains feedback loops, compensatory mechanisms, dose effects, genetic variation, and interactions that make simple pathway reasoning unreliable. Clinical outcomes matter. Randomized trials matter. Replication matters. Long-term safety matters. Hard endpoints matter. The further Brain Defenders travels from exercise, metabolic health, and basic lifestyle medicine into intervention-specific optimization, the more carefully the reader should distinguish established evidence from informed speculation. What the book proves. Strictly speaking, a popular science book does not itself prove the biomedical thesis it describes. But Brain Defender successfully demonstrates several broader propositions. Microglia are not passive background cells. They perform central immune and maintenance functions in the brain. Microglial dysfunction and neuroinflammation are deeply relevant to neurodegenerative research. Cellular metabolism influences immune cell behavior. Metabolic and cardiovascular health cannot sensibly be separated from long-term brain health. Lifestyle factors can modify several established risk factors associated with cognitive decline, and prevention deserves much more attention before symptoms appear. Recent research supports the importance of multi-domain intervention. The U.S. Pointer program tested combinations of exercise, diet, cognitive and social engagement, and cardiometabolic risk management in more than 2,000 at-risk older adults, reflecting the movement away from the search for one magical lifestyle variable. That multi-domain philosophy fits Perlmutter extremely well. Brains live inside people. People live inside systems of behavior. Changing one variable may help. Changing the entire risk environment may matter more. What the book does not prove. The book does not prove that neurodegeneration is primarily caused by lifestyle. It does not prove that Alzheimer's disease can generally be prevented. It does not prove that microglia can be reduced to a simple good versus bad switch. It does not prove that one dietary pattern will work optimally for everyone. It does not prove that supplements marketed around microglial biology prevent dementia. It does not prove that controlling glucose guarantees neurological protection. It does not prove that hyperbaric oxygen should become routine Alzheimer's prevention. And it certainly does not erase genetics, aging, or stochastic biological events. These limits do not make the book worthless. They make its strongest message more precise. We may not control neurological destiny. We can influence some of the conditions affecting neurological risk. That is a smaller claim. It is also a far more defensible one. What most summaries miss. The book is not fundamentally about reducing inflammation. That phrase is too vague. Its deeper argument concerns state. The same biological machinery can produce different outcomes depending upon its environment. Microglia are useful precisely because they embody that idea. They can clear debris or contribute to damage. Immune activation can protect or harm. Metabolism can support cellular resilience or produce dysfunction. Stress can be adaptive briefly and destructive chronically. That makes Brain Defenders less a book about one disease than a book about biological context. The body rarely contains isolated heroes and villains. Functions become helpful or harmful depending upon timing, intensity, duration, and environment. That is more sophisticated than the marketing language sometimes makes the book sound. What most people misunderstand. The easiest misunderstanding is Perlmutter says lifestyle determines whether you get Alzheimer's. That is too strong. A better interpretation is that lifestyle modifies multiple systems associated with neurological risk, and microglia may provide one important mechanism linking those systems to brain health. Risk modification is not destiny control. Someone can do everything right and still develop neurological disease. Another person may accumulate substantial risk factors and remain cognitively healthy. Population probabilities do not issue individual guarantees. That matters morally as well as scientifically. Disease should never become evidence that someone failed to optimize themselves correctly. The dangerous misreading. The most dangerous interpretation of Brain Defenders would be to replace medical care with self-directed biohacking. A reader might encounter the language of inflammation, metabolic dysfunction, or microglial optimization, and decide that a prescribed medication is unnecessary, that supplements can treat cognitive impairment, or that experimental therapies should be pursued because they possess an exciting mechanism. That is not justified by the evidence. Another mistake would be obsessive optimization. Health metrics can improve decision-making. They can also turn normal biology into a permanent self-surveillance project. Humans do not need perfect glucose curves, perfect sleep scores, perfect microbiomes, and dozens of supplements to possess healthy brains. The objective is risk reduction, not biological perfection. The tailored interpretation. The deepest message of Brain Defenders is not really that microglia determine your future. It is that maintenance matters before failure becomes visible. Modern life teaches people to react to breakdown. Repair the car when the warning light appears. Treat blood pressure after it becomes dangerously high. Lose weight after diabetes develops. Think about the brain when memory disappears. Perlmutter attacks that chronology. The brain is being maintained today. Its blood vessels are being affected today. Its immune cells are responding today. Its metabolic environment exists today. Its reserve is being built or depleted today. The powerful implication is not that every decision dramatically changes your dementia risk. Most individual decisions probably do very little. The consequence comes from accumulation. One walk is trivial. 10 years of regular activity is not. One poor night's sleep is trivial. Years of chronic sleep disruption are not. One processed meal is trivial. A dietary pattern is not. One stressful day is trivial. A permanently dysregulated life is not. The book's real unit of analysis is therefore not the hack. It is the pattern. That is where Brain Defenders is at its strongest. Why this book still matters. The book arrived at an unusually important moment in dementia research. Alzheimer's treatment has entered an era in which disease-modifying drugs targeting amyloid can alter disease progression for selected patients. But treatment remains difficult, expensive, and far from curative. At the same time, prevention research increasingly examines multiple modifiable risk factors rather than searching for one lifestyle miracle. Microglial science adds another dimension. Researchers increasingly understand that immune cells are not simply responding after neurodegeneration has occurred. They may participate throughout the disease process. And modern single-cell technologies are revealing far more complex microglial states than older models suggested. That makes Perlmutter's central subject well chosen. The danger lies only in racing ahead of the evidence. The microglial revolution is real. The complete personal prescription for manipulating it is not yet settled. If you only remember 3 ideas. 1. Your brain has an immune system. Microglia help maintain and defend the central nervous system. Their behavior is increasingly important to understanding aging and neurodegenerative disease. Thinking about brain health, therefore, requires thinking about immunity as well as neurons. 2. Metabolic health and brain health are connected. Glucose regulation, cardiovascular function, exercise, diet, sleep, and systemic inflammation do not stop at the neck. The metabolic environment of the body influences the environment in which the brain operates. Protecting the brain, therefore, begins long before neurological symptoms appear. 3. Build resilience instead of chasing miracles. The strongest actions in the book are cumulative. Move regularly. Sleep properly. Maintain metabolic and cardiovascular health. Eat predominantly nutrient-dense whole foods. Avoid smoking and excessive alcohol. Reduce preventable head trauma and address relevant medical risks. Supplements and emerging technologies may prove useful. They are additions to the foundation, not substitutes for it. The sentence that explains the book. Your brain's future is influenced not only by what eventually goes wrong inside it, but by the biological environment you repeatedly create while it is still working well. The real-life test. Imagine 2 people approaching middle age. Both currently think clearly. Neither has diagnosed neurological disease. The first waits. Brain health is something for old age. Exercise is inconsistent. Sleep is chronically short. Blood pressure is rarely checked. Metabolic markers gradually deteriorate. Most meals are ultra-processed. Alcohol is routine. Health action begins only when a diagnosis arrives. The second person does something less dramatic. They walk and train regularly. They preserve muscle. They monitor blood pressure and metabolic health at sensible intervals. They prioritize sleep. Most food comes from minimally processed ingredients. They remain socially and cognitively engaged. They do not smoke. They limit alcohol. They protect their head. They seek medical treatment when appropriate. They do not purchase 30 supplements. They do not need to. That second person has not purchased immunity from Alzheimer's disease. They have done something more realistic. They have improved several components of their long-term risk environment simultaneously. That is, brain defenders translated into behavior. 5 questions to test whether you understood the book. Why are microglia both protectors and potential contributors to disease? Because the immune response required to protect and repair the brain can become damaging when its activity becomes inappropriate, chronic, or dysregulated. Microglia, therefore, cannot be classified as inherently beneficial or harmful. 2. What does immunometabolism add to the argument? It explains why metabolic state and immune behavior should not be viewed separately. Changes in cellular energy processing can alter immune function, providing a mechanism through which broader metabolic health may influence the brain. 3. Why does Perlmutter emphasize prevention before symptoms? Because the biological processes contributing to neurological vulnerability may develop years before cognitive impairment becomes clinically obvious. Waiting for symptoms can therefore mean acting after considerable pathology has accumulated. 4. Where should readers be most skeptical? Where mechanistic plausibility becomes a specific treatment claim. Supplements, experimental drugs, hyperbaric oxygen, and emerging technologies require stronger clinical evidence before they should be treated as proven methods of preventing neurodegenerative disease. 5. What is the most practical lesson? Do not organize brain health around one miracle intervention. Improve the entire environment in which the brain ages. The final lesson. Brain Defenders asks readers to replace one comforting but dangerous assumption, that if the brain works today, there's nothing to think about until something goes wrong. Perlmutter's microglial framework makes prevention feel immediate. Inside the brain is an immune system continuously interpreting signals from injury, infection, metabolism, and its surrounding environment. That system can protect tissue brilliantly. Under the wrong conditions, it can also participate in processes associated with degeneration. Science has not yet given us a switch capable of forcing every microglial cell into a permanently protective state. It may never be that simple. But that uncertainty does not make prevention meaningless. The strongest brain health strategy emerging from brain defenders is surprisingly unglamorous. Protect metabolism. Preserve cardiovascular health, move, sleep, nourish the body well. Reduce avoidable toxic exposures. Limit alcohol. Avoid smoking. Protect against head injury. Remain socially and cognitively engaged, and use medicine intelligently, rather than waiting for catastrophe. The futuristic therapies are fascinating. The cellular biology is rapidly advancing. The supplements are tempting. But the book's most important intervention is a change in timing. Do not wait until a healthy brain becomes a damaged brain before deciding that it deserves protecting.